Downstream in the petroleum industry refers to a process of converting oil and gas into finished products, like from crude oil to petrol and diesel. According to the Ministry of Mines and Energy's white paper, the country's energy policy ensures the security of energy supply to support the growing demand for energy services in the country. But how do Namibian regulations actually impact the oil sector, and what are the effects of oil exploration on the environment? Good evening, I'm Jonas Mbambo. Geoenergy today focuses on the petroleum downstream regulations, which include the issuing of licenses in the country. The Minister of Mines and Energy, Tom Alwendo, is joining me to outline the efforts made by both the Line Ministry and the main players. He is also here to showcase how the Namibian regulations impact the oil sector and what the effect of oil exploration is on the environment. Very good evening to you, sir, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and good evening, and welcome back.
Thank you so much. Always a great pleasure.
Great.
When you talk about the downstream, one automatically assumes that there is upstream and something in between as well. I believe it's called the middle stream. Can you just give us a breakdown of what the major parts are in the oil and gas supply pipeline is?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think it's, although in your introduction you say we're going to talk about the downstream, and as you say, that suggests that there's an upstream. So let's start with upstream first, and then just maybe to correctly understand how the sector works. Yes, the oil and gas sector is divided generally into three parts, what they call the upstream, the middle stream, and then the downstream. But generally the downstream and the middle stream is more or less the same kind of thing. But let's start with the upstream. The upstream simply really just talks about, or it confines itself to the explorations itself. That's really, I think, the main activity of the upstream, to do explorations and either discover oil or gas. That's really where the process starts. Now, in terms of the how we go about the upstream, we have divided the country into what we call a licensing map, where you have got almost throughout the country, onshore and offshore. We have divided into licensing map where you have got blocks of or the average of like 10,000 square kilometer, of a block, and those blocks are now the ones those who are interested to do explorations, they will then apply for the particular block and say we want to apply for this block because we want to do exploration for oil or for gas or for both.
Yeah.
And that's now really the upstream. That's what we talk about, the upstreams. The middle stream will start normally once now the gas is found or the oil is found. It's obviously now transported to a refinery. It's refined, and once you have refined the products, obviously it's distributed for consumption by the consumer, whether it's motorists or whether industries. So that part becomes now the middle stream, downstream of the sector. So that's how it works. But maybe we can still just talk more about the upstream. Then how do people then get involved in the upstream? Maybe that's something which you can talk about.
Yeah. Let's also maybe focus on the current state of the petroleum downstream sector in the country. How would you, in a nutshell, explain that to us?
The current downstream, as I say, by definition, start with the refinery. We don't have that part of where we refine crude oil, or where we will have, transform gas into some other products. So we don't have that part.
So we import finished products.
So the downstream really concentrate on the importation of finished product like oil, diesel, and some other products that are then distributed to the consumers. So really the current Downstream is really about the importation of the finished product and distribute those products to the consumers and retailing it to the consumers.
And why does the government regulate this industry?
There's a very good reason why there's regulations. You do have countries that don't regulate petrol price, for example, so which means people sell at whatever price it's offered by the seller. But I think historically there's a reason that petrol, diesel, just like electricity or like water, those are very, very strategic commodities that are necessary for the country to develop. And therefore, what you really want is not to have too much volatility affecting the price. Sometimes people think petrol is actually, somehow sold by the government. The government doesn't sell petrol. Mm-hmm. The government doesn't import petrol either. But it was said because of the importance of the product itself, and also because of the inherent volatility in the price, because number one, this is always imported, and therefore the exchange rate come into the equation. Of course, the normal supply and demand come into the equations. So it was said, now let's rather drive a smooth transition or a smooth progression of how the pricing of this product is, to make sure that it make it easier or predictable for the industry to know that at least we can expect the price of petrol to be at this level, even if the exchange rate were to fluctuate too much. There will be a smooth either downward trend or a smooth upward trend. Uh-huh. So that's really the reason, just to say it's a very important strategic commodity, and therefore if you really let it to the private sector to be the one to decide on whatever price they're going to do, it may actually have some other side effect to the progression or to the development of the economy.
Uh-huh. Minister, if one were to want to go into the downstream industry, obviously there are licenses that are needed in this very sophisticated market. Mm-hmm. How does one go about it? Where does it start? And perhaps also, is there a difference between the license that a petrol station owner has and that of the major distributors?
Yeah, there's the couple of licenses, and maybe let's first start with the importing companies. As I was saying, government does not import petrol into the country. Petrol is imported by private sector companies. You can think of the likes of Puma, Shell, Total, and even our own company, NAMCO. They are the ones who are importing these products. Now, for them to be able to do that, they need to have what we call the wholesale license. So they need to apply for a wholesale license, so that you can then import the oil and sell that in bulk. Now, if you've been in Walvis Bay, around Walvis Bay, you see a lot of storage facilities, and that storage facility normally belongs to the importing companies, like, as I say, the major ones. So they import and then they store that, and from there they will then distribute to the retailers. So now, for you then to go into the retail business, you'll then have to come to the Ministry of Mines and Energy and apply for a retail license, what they call a retail license. Now, that retail license, basically the requirement, obviously you would have done your own business case. I mean, you also need some money from the bank. I'm sure you would have gone to the bank. The bank will probably look at it and say, okay, where's your business plan? So it must make business sense. But what the ministry will look at is the case, like, for example, since this is a controlled price, you're not going to sell the price, the fuel at whatever cost, or price you want to pay, to make up. We also want to make sure then that where you are going to be allocating this, it's really something that can be viable. For example, we will know that if you have got a town with say 20,000 residents, you probably cannot really make business by having 10 or 20 filling stations. You probably viable if you've got 3 or 4. So what we'll then look at is now the volumes of the demand, for the potential demand for that retail station where you want to put it, such then that it does not really make all the others less profitable, because, as I said, the prices are really controlled, and therefore, and even the margin that you are going to be making is controlled. So we make sure that at least that, the site where you want to do will make it viable. We'll also want to make sure at least how you are going to build it, because the storage of the petrol itself is regulated. You cannot just dig a simple hole and just put it in there. There's some standard by which you must actually construct the storage facility for the oil for the retail business. So those will be the criteria, which is the location where you're going to put it, that it makes sense in terms of the demand for that, accordance to the standard that are already also put up by the minister. These are the standard for having a retail licenses. So you have a wholesale license and then the retail licenses. And we also have got what we call distribution licenses. Some oil companies do not distribute themselves to their customers. They basically use transporters, and those transportation companies also need to have a distribution license, because it's again a flammable commodity that will be transported, and therefore it must be done in a safer way. That also need to be applied for from the ministry. So we'll have 3 licenses: the wholesale licenses, the distribution, and also the retail licenses.
And how long do these licenses last? Are they renewable on a yearly basis, or is it a certain period of time?
They are, unlike the other license we talked about the last time, like the EPL that expires. This is really just a business license. It doesn't necessarily have an expiry date, but what it does have, though, is the conditions under which you must operate this license. So we have got inspectors who will normally go and inspect these retail outlets to make sure that they still do comply with the standards required. For example, if your storage tanks are not really up to standard anymore, or even the pumping equipment themselves are not, obviously the minister will then demand to say you either rectify that, or if you cannot rectify, then we may then actually take away the license so that you cannot trade. So the inspectors just really make sure that at least that you are still trading under the safe condition, and therefore you don't necessarily have a time frame under which you have to renew anything, but at least you have to comply with the standard of operating a retail license.
So in other words, if you're not complying with the regulations, at any given point the ministry had reserves the right of revoking the license.
The minister can say, we would give you a certain time. We may say, look, for now we don't think you are operating this safely. Maybe you stop operating until you rectify that, and then we'll come and do inspections. And if we are then satisfied that your operation is taking place under safe conditions, we'll then again allow you then to reopen your retail fuel.
All right. So just joining us, you're watching Geoenergy. We'll be right back, and after the break we'll be talking a bit about NAMCO. Stay tuned. Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, you're watching Geoenergy, and today we're talking about the downstream industry in Namibia. Minister, before the arrival of NAMCO, there wasn't any state-owned companies that were involved in the retail of petroleum products. Can you perhaps explain to us why it took for such a long time for the government to establish an entity that would partake in a very, as you said before, very important and strategic sector?
Now, the question, the way you frame it, you frame the question in such a way that you presuppose that government must necessarily be part of this sector. And you're saying because it was important. I mean, if it's willing to regulate it, why not participate? Well, which actually make it even more difficult, because when you are regulating an industry, generally people will think that you should not probably get into that industry that you regulate, because now you end up regulating yourself. But I don't think that was the reason why government didn't get involved in that. And also when you say it took that long, as I have said, the traders in the industry has always been, of course, private sector companies, and I really think it should be like that. It's really a straightforward kind of industry where people can actually invest in the thing. And when you run an economy, you should also not want, as a government, to always get involved in sectors, because as a government, really, your natural role is really to regulate industries. Mm-hmm. But obviously, there are certain industries that are very, very difficult to bring up to speed. Number one, either because maybe it's just the risk maybe just too high, or just certain things which is just not happening. Therefore, as a government, you may really want to do that so that at least the private investor can start also becoming comfortable, and therefore they start to invest. So it's not really a given to say government should necessarily actually get involved in that. But with NAMCO, really, the issue was that, there was always a belief that, Namibia has some potential for oil and gas. A very, very important sector, a very risky sector. And the idea was then to say, why, just like any other countries, why don't we actually start to have a national oil company that will first concentrate on the upstream to discover the oil, discover the gas. So that was really the main idea, to say, let's have a national oil company that's going to do explorations, and hopefully, like all the other private sector companies, hopefully they will discover, either gas or they will discover oil. Now, as time went on, obviously, as a company, you need also to start looking for other opportunities. And I think sometimes back then, NAMCO felt, since there's no prohibition to say that a national oil company cannot also get involved in the downstreams, mm-hmm. They also then started actually getting involved in the downstream, not only in the importation of oil, but also to actually distribute, and also having, I think you might have seen some outlets which are branded NAMCO.
Yes, sir.
But that's also quite important, I think, to explain. When you see this petrol station branded either Puma or branded Shell or branded Total, it does not mean that those retail outlets are run or managed by Puma. No, it doesn't mean that. It could just well be owned by Jonas Bambo, except because now you are supplying, or you are being supplied by Puma. Puma will then brand that as a Puma filling stations. So all what you see there is not really that they are owned by the major oil company that are importing, but simply because they are the ones supplying those. Most of those will be owned by private sector people who just want to get into the sectors. And that's what I think in the space where NAMCO then have stepped in to say, just like all the other major oil companies, they also have got this petrol station, who normally they will have operators. They don't necessarily actually operate themselves, but they just brand them because they're supplying the product to such retail outlets.
Mm. So if, for example, Jonas Mbambo and company decides to buy into the NAMCO name or brand, is that possible?
Yeah, it is possible. What would you do is for you to identify a market that is underserved. Mm-hmm. If you go to Oshakati and say, okay, I think Oshakati can still accommodate another filling stations, and therefore you do your business, and then you say you identify a place where to put a retail, you will come to the ministries. We will then ask you to say, okay, well, it looks like a good plan, and who's going to be your supplier? You would then go into various companies, including NAMCO, to say, I'm going to start this business, and I want you to be my supplier. They will then agree to say, okay, fine, where's your retail, and therefore they then do the branding so that it will then appear that it's like a NAMCO filling station. Mm.
So but when I approach NAMCO, I have to come with, like you said before, the business plan and and have my environmental impact assessment report, or who carries that
No,
out?
those requirements for, like, you have got environmental clearance certificate, as you say, yeah, yes, you need to have that, because if you are going to store this product that are already, as I say, flammable, you need to have environmental clearance certificate issued by the Ministry of Environment. But those are the regulators' issues. So those, you come with those to the ministry. We assess those. NAMCO will simply be concerned, well, not probably concerned. They need to have people who can push their product. So for them, as long as you got a retail license and you got a site, most of all these companies would want to supply you, because that's how they distribute their product. So NAMCO does not really have to regulate or to say, oh, you have that. But the moment you got a license, they also know that you could not have been given a license if you did not satisfy the certain conditions. What they may not want is probably to get into an agreement with you to supply fuel. In 2-3 months, you can't do business anymore. For whatever reason, you can't do business, and therefore they cannot supply you anymore. So they maybe if you ask questions, look, are you sure you know what you're doing? Because I don't want to get into a supply agreement with somebody who is just going to operate this thing for 2 months and then they're going to close down. So they may do their own due diligence, but not for the purpose of giving the license, but just for the purpose of satisfying themselves to say, yeah, this is a business person I can deal with, because we'll be, of course, building a relationship to supply them with this product.
Yeah. When news broke that NAMCO was going to enter the retail and distribution business, it was met with some resistance, a lot of criticism, especially from the private sectors already in the industry. Why do you think that was the case? Was it because of the fear that, as you mentioned, that, well, self-regulation? How exactly is it going to work?
I think the major part of this uneasiness about NAMCO joining the downstream sector, I think it's simply driven by competition. You know how people always tell you, the competition is good, which is good, but it's probably competition is good for the consumer. It's not so much good for the operators, for the companies. In fact, I'm sure that every company would want probably to be a monopoly in which they operate, because if you're a monopoly, you are the only one. Although everybody tells you, no, we like competition, but it's but for the consumer, obviously competition is always good, because you got choices. I can go and get my product from company A or company B or C. So really, I think the major concern there was simply to say, well, the market is getting crowded now. You have about 5 companies, and other companies coming in, and now you're gonna, of course, have to share the sector. I think that was really more or less, I think, the reason. Yes, there may also be an issue to say, okay, well, government as a regulator of an industry, and therefore you're also a participant. But I would still want to make a distinction between government and government-owned companies. There's a distinction. It's not really necessary to say NAMCO is government. NAMCO operates just like any other private sector owned. Of course, they got a shareholder with the government. But it will be not correct to classify state-owned companies as government. I mean, that's really government, obviously. As long as, of course, they are managed and operated on the business line. And as you might know now, we also got government companies that are called commercial state-owned companies, which means they are really being managed and run as commercial, just like any other private sector-owned companies. So those are not really part of as government as a regulator. Yeah.
Many Namibians have heard about the much publicized price escalation to construct the national oil storage facility in the country. Many people have heard about the oil storage facility, but what exactly is it, and maybe also the rationale behind the construction of the storage facility?
Okay. It's good that you bring that up. I think there has been yeah, there has been some media report about this particular project and how it started. It really started way back in 2012. And it started off by saying, look, we as a country, we rely on petrol or fuel that's being imported. We don't have our own source of this. No, it's normally imported. And also imported by the private sector companies, of course, for commercial trading. Now, fuel being a very strategic commodity, what's going to happen one day if, for whatever reason, we are not able to import fuel into the country? It will then mean from that day particular, maybe you might only have 2 or 3 days of supply that might be available, and then you run dry. It was then agreed to say, well, for us really to improve our security of supply for fuel, we really need to think about investing in a storage facility that can really carry enough fuel for the country should there be some problem. Such that you don't just close shop on the 31st day or second day after the disruption of the importation of fuel. So build a storage that at least can carry you at least for another 30 days to give you enough space then to rearrange how you're going to continue to import fuel into the countries. That was really the reason why this facility was built. The contention or the issue people normally, the public will ask, is that how come then initially it was going to be built at this cost and then suddenly it's built at much higher cost. Yes, it's true, but what really happened is that the way it was conceived and that cost that was then publicly known at the time it was tendered for, the way it was conceived. Unfortunately, as we went on, we realized that now if you're really going to build something like a storage like this, you also need to have some other facilities to make it much functional for this, and therefore there were then some other elements added to the project, and therefore it basically became 3 times the size as it was conceived initially. Yes, people might say, well, then, how come then, that was not conceived at the time? Yes, that's probably a valid argument to make, but the point I really just want to make is that it's not true that the very same project that was tendered for about $3 billion became a $5 billion building the same thing. No, it's not. It's really became much bigger. In fact, if you have gone to Walsh Bay, like for example the jetty that actually take the petrol and the pipes that actually take the fuel to the tankers. It was not intended to be that big or that long, unfortunately. So it's not that it was built at the higher cost, but doing the same thing. That's one thing to say. Now, maybe there's also another aspect to this project that it's important to talk about. And that is that not long ago, the price of crude came down substantially, such that really most of the oil companies were selling the crude almost for nothing. And that's what the question to say now that we have got a oil storage, how come we cannot then simply buy up all the oil, because now it's cheaper, and then at least we will then have cheap oil. Yeah. First, the oil that was cheap, it was not refined product that we import. We don't store. The storage was not built to store crude oil, and the price that fell dramatically was really the price of crude oil. The impact of the low price for crude, yes, had a downward trend on the petrol, but not as much as the price of the crude that fell. And therefore, it's not necessarily true to say now that we got this, now the price of oil almost remained the same. It was not possible for you to say, okay, no, let's import. Number one, The project also has not completed as yet. It's not fully commissioned. We were supposed to have commissioned the project in May, but unfortunately because of the COVID-19 that came, and we couldn't get all the supply to come in actually to finish the product. Now we are going to commission that only in November, towards the end of November.
This year.
This year. So even if it's true then that the price we're talking about was the price of fuel, we could not have used the storage because it's not finalized as yet. So, but I think it's very important to make sure to say, even when it's finished, we are not storing crude oil, we are storing finished product.
The fact that we have the ability to store our own fuel, does that mean that as a vehicle owner, should I be happy by assuming that fuel and diesel or petrol and diesel are going to be much cheaper?
Well, again, I think the petrol price, the price of petrol, the price of fuel, when you say cheaper, it will be cheap or expensive to the extent at what price you bought it. So it's not a case that you simply decide to say it's going to be cheap today because I've got a storage. Because the idea is always to say whatever you have stored, it should be sold to the consumer at a price where we bought it, plus a margin that is added. So the storage in itself does not really make it any cheaper for the consumer. As I say, the main reason for this storage facility is just related for us to increase the security of supply in such a way that if there's a disruption, you don't run around trying to figure out where you're going to get your oil importation the next day. At least you've got some time to reschedule or to re-strategize how you're going to get it into the country. But in terms of price itself, it doesn't. The price really will just always be regulated by, of course, how much do you buy it, and obviously the other factor like the demand and supply, the normal issue about how you price. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was talk of having a oil refinery in the country. Is that still a viable idea, or is it still a pipe dream?
It's true. There has been attempts or talk to have an investment in the refinery, but again, it's not as if it was government that was going to invest in the refinery. It isn't government that was going to invest in the refinery.
Where did the proposal come from?
The proposal usually will come from private sector investors. Because, for a refinery, they might have to get some licensing, certain things that must be licensed, and therefore they will then approach government to say, we want to set up a refinery. But it's not government investing in a refinery. But I think what really has been the problem, like any other investment, you have to assess the risk. The risk of investing in the refinery, obviously, is not a cheap investment, it's a lot of money. You need to start to think about how you are going to de-risk the issue of supply of the crude oil. Where are you going to get the crude oil? Where are you going to buy from? For how long will you be able to buy that crude from wherever you're going to get it? Because a huge investment like that, you probably need to be able to have that supply at least for the next 10, 15 years. Otherwise, if very short supply, you won't be able to successfully run a refinery project. So the issue of where you're going to get the crude, and also about the market. Do you have sufficient market where you are going to then sell the finished product? The Namibian market, for example, depending on the size of the refinery, are you going to only refine product for the Namibian consumers, or are you going to look beyond Namibia? And those are all the factors that's actually now put into the project. And if you go to the financiers and say, well, this is the package I have got, they look at it and they say, well, probably the risk is too high and nothing really happens. And I think we still do have now and then people who says, they still think they can make it work by working on the supply of the crude, and by also de-risking some of the issues such that they make it bankable to go to the financiers and get the money to invest. So it's really, I think, the issue of not having figure out how to de-risk the project for that to come on stream. But as I say, there are still people who now and then will say, look, I think we can make it work, and we encourage people to say, look, wherever we can assist as government in terms of licensing issues or whatever, that we can do, but not necessarily as investors in the project.
Before we go for a break, perhaps maybe we can talk about the economic spin-offs of the industry. We all know that, well, it's about selling petroleum products, but how else does this industry benefit the average Namibian, or the Namibian that feels like he wants to take part in this sector?
Then the Namibian participation issue, if you start from the upstream, which is a good start to say, how possible is that Namibian can participate in the upstream? Now, obviously, up to now, we have not discovered any oil and thing, and therefore it's not really an interesting area where people really want actually to spend their money on. Yeah. But right now, what we have got as a practice is like, whenever we actually issue a license to an exploration company for oil, we normally will always insist on having a 15% stake in that license, 5% for local Namibian entrepreneurs, and 10% to the government, normally through NAMCO. So that has been the arrangement. But obviously, if you find some commercial finding, obviously then you need to start to talk about the operational agreement and how that's going to be shared. That's something else, down the line. When it comes to the downstream, I would probably say, most of the operators are Namibians. Either they are distributors, or the one who are transporting the oil, or whether the owner of the filling stations, those are all Namibians. And therefore, from that perspective, we do have Namibians who are participating. In terms of the importation, obviously, apart from NAMCO, the major companies, those are international companies like the Puma and the Shell. Those are internationally owned companies. One may say probably at that level, there are still probably room for more Namibian entrepreneurs who really wish to become wholesale importers of oil. So that's still an open space.
All right, quickly go for a break and we'll be right back. You're watching Geoenergy with a specific focus on licensing and regulation as far as the downstream is concerned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Geoenergy with me, Jonas Mbambo, joined by the Minister of Mines and Energy, Tom Alwento. Honourable Minister, let's talk a little bit about green energy. We know for a fact that we have been dependent on fossil fuels for a very, very long time, and perhaps maybe in the next 100, maybe even 2, don't know. But we're also seeing the emergence of green energy. Many companies encouraged to opt for green energy or alternative energy sources, whereas some car manufacturers are already offering that alternative, which is electric vehicles, which are really expensive compared to the cars that run on fuel. And there are many electric cars in the world, including Namibia as well. What is the government's stance on green energy, and let's maybe also touch on the electric vehicles, and what plans are in place relating to charging stations and related issues?
This is all to do with the environment. Green energy, green investment. The whole idea is about that, whatever it is we are doing as countries, we must know chances are those activities has got an impact on the environment. And as you know, Namibia, like many other countries, has signed up to this UN international, climate agreement. Yes. They call what, COP20 or COP21. And the whole idea is just to say, let's make sure we do not invest in such a way that we are going to destroy the environment. Now, when it comes to this specific industry in the oil and gas, for years, because of the technology and the way things are done, obviously, the oil, has become, in some ways, a polluter to the environment, and therefore the people are talking about, you need to start having cleaner energies, and that's why you have got, for example, now instead of people getting energy from coal, people are still looking, why don't you use the wind and use the sun? It's all part of energy because of the environment. So yes, I think we all agree that we should not do certain things to the detriment of the environment. But I also have to qualify that to say, yes, while that is true, and that's why we also have got Environmental Management Act, we should also not cut ourselves off potential investment that can also develop the economy. For example, if you had coal and people say, well, don't do coal at all. But there's still an argument to say, well, if I can still do in somehow safer manner, I mean, even if you go to coal plants, it's not how it was done like maybe 25 years ago. I mean, they're new technology. So we should also not want to close ourselves completely of certain investments simply because of the environment, but rather let's concentrate, how do we still want to do that, having taken in account the potential impact on the environment. And we have got one of the stringent, I think, environmental requirements. Most activities that are listed as activities, you cannot get a license before you get that environmental clearance certificate. So we are doing that. In fact, that reminds me, even you may have followed, I think, a couple of weeks back, when we talk about the upstream, there was this thing about, we're going to do fracking, it's going to damage the environment, and therefore that should not be done. Obviously, the ministry, we explained that, look, there's no fracking taking place, there's no drilling taking place, and all those activities, there are listed activities in terms of the Environmental Management Act, and therefore, before anybody does that, they need to get a license that says, yes, we have looked at the environmental management program that you have got in place, and therefore we are satisfied that you will be able to manage the risk coming out of that, not to damage the environment. So for me, really, it's a matter of making sure that at least that we follow stringent criteria about how people get given a license, but not to simply say, we're not going to do that. With regard to the electrical cars, yes, I have seen some people marketing to say, look, the electrical cars, as you say, they are right now much more expensive than the normal car, and therefore that will probably take a time for that to happen. And again, this is the private sector activity. It's not like, again, that the government is going to sincerely have to say, this is how you're going to do that or not do that. That's really investment that, and therefore, I think private sector operators, the moment there's an opportunity, commercial opportunity, it will happen. And therefore, I have no doubt that, in the next, decade or so, as this vehicle become more affordable, and also, firming up the technology that's actually behind this, I'm sure it will also come to us. The charging station and all that will be part of the investment drive, and therefore, it will be a sector that will develop by itself as we go on. But right now, it's not really that much of a sector. I mean, most of the vehicle that people might have, sometimes they are more for demonstration. I have driven one. It's something that, I think it's with us, and it will continue, I think, to become more and more affordable.
There's an argument by some saying that smaller, less developed countries are being bullied into this whole green energy thing while they're sitting on minerals that they can exploit and develop the country in all sectors. Powerful countries that have already developed and benefited from fossil fuels and all that. Some people argued, no, they're saying, well, but why shouldn't I explore oil while I have oil here? And coming from a country like Namibia that is still developing, where do we strike the balance? If, let's say, we're to strike oil tomorrow, where do we strike the balance of exploiting this oil, but at the same time also protecting their environment.
Yeah. You bring up a very important point. In fact, if you have been following the international discussion, even when we're talking about the COP21 agreement and all the environmental issues, the arguments being made by the developing country was always like to say, you guys aren't being fair. The developed countries aren't being fair. Number one, they are actually the heaviest polluter of the environment. They have been doing that all over the years. Now, obviously, now that new technology has come, then I will say, look, all of us are just going to stop doing that. So the argument has been, well, in that case, we of course we do care for the environment. Right now, we don't really pollute as much as you guys do. Now, if you are going then to stop us to do anything at all simply because of that, then at least there must be some compensation for us then to be able also then to embrace the technology that is possible. And that's why you probably now and then you have got like this climate fund and to try and really source some investment coming from that. Because really, if you simply insist to say, well, we have polluted enough and therefore we're just going to stop everybody and therefore whatever resource you might have, it will just stop. I think that will not be actually an equal or treatment of how development should happen. But as I say, we agree that we need to find better ways to manage the environment, and that's why we have these laws. But to simply say, stop it, I really don't think that's in the best interest of the developing countries. And I think that continue to say, look, if we were to do that, then at least what are the developed countries able to do then to assist the developing countries who may now not do some of the things that were done by other people simply because now the world have moved on. And therefore, we agree we don't want to pollute, but there must be some sort of compensation. So I think that's where the discussion is.
And do you think that developing countries are being taken seriously enough when such concerns are being aired, or maybe one day we'll come to a point where en masse African nations or these mineral-rich countries that are still developing will say, no, we want no part of this and we are leaving this. We don't want to be party of this agreement anymore.
Yeah, I think that's why the negotiations are normally done under the UN, which is supposed to be a body of all of us, and therefore, whatever agreement is going to be, to be arrived at, it should be really having taken care of all the arguments. But I can foresee a situation where if the developing country were to say, well, what is being proposed is not really in the best interest of our own issues, obviously then people may find different routes. I do remember, for example, when we were developing the Sustainable Development Goal under the UN, Africa came up with a common position to say these are the issues that we as Africans want to be addressed in that SDGs. Of course, there was a resistance because obviously everybody has got their own issues and therefore they want to make those to be the international issues. But I think because of the common voice, the one voice, under the African Union, where they say, no, these are our common positions, most of the SDG as we know them today, they really have been influenced by that common positions. And therefore, even in these cases, when we continue to talk, our strength will be there if we continue then to have common position on certain issue to say that's what we would demand, to say, if we're going to do that, then also then the other side must also do that. So I think that will be the only strength when there's a common purpose of how to deal with some of these issues. So as individual countries, obviously it's not going to be always that easy.
So slowly but surely the narrative is starting to change.
I think it's starting to change. People are starting to listen also to say, just because the northern hemisphere country have got these challenges, you cannot simply now suddenly say that's now how international way of thinking should have. There must be also other voices to say, no, yes, it might happen that way, but on our side, that's how things look like. And therefore, you always got strength in numbers, and therefore, as a continent and as the African Union continue to get stronger and stronger in its own negotiation strategies, I think it will come to a point where at least in those international agreements, we will also get something which is, beneficial to our issues as well.
Lastly, Namibia has been applauded internationally for having some of the best laws in terms of protection and the preservation of the environment and ecosystems. How would you say government is balancing implementing these laws in terms of oil and gas exploration, but at the same time still maintaining the stance that's on the white paper, all those principles that are embodied in the Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As I was saying, we have one of the best environmental management framework. Mm-hmm. But that framework is not to prevent for us to develop. The framework is really there to make sure that our development does not adversely impact the environment. And that is why, as I said, all the activities that are listed activity under that Environmental Management Act cannot be done without you having actually gone through and done that. And it's very, very important. As I said, what you really don't want is actually to really destroy the environment, because everybody, people want to still to be able to live here in a safer environment, for generations to come. But again, I just have to emphasize the point that the idea is not to stop development. The idea is to develop in such a way that it's done in a safer way.
Mm-hmm. Honourable Minister, we've come to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to our next discussion.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Welcome. And with that, we've come to the end of the discussion. Thank you for the Minister there for providing us with an in-depth understanding of the issuings of downstream petroleum licenses, and also the impact that oil and gas exploration might have on the environment. If you have any questions or you want to find out more about how you can get involved, contact the PRO of the Ministry at info@mme.gov.na. You can alternatively also check out their Facebook page, the Ministry of Mines and Energy Namibia, or visit their website at mme.gov.na. With that said, we've come to the end of the show. Till next time, cheers for now.